Welcome, everybody, to today's APS Colloquium, which has been given by Masha Kazachenko. We'd actually invited the NSO director, Christoph Keller.
Hello.
Where are you? To do the introduction.
Maybe he's parking. Maybe he's parking.
He got busy somewhere else. So instead, I'm going to ask Mark Rast, who's kindly volunteered to behave as co-director of NSO or something like that.
Thank you so much, Mark.
So not as dramatic as having the NSO director here, but let me try to introduce you. Masha. So Masha got her master's degree in mathematics at St. Peter's State University in Russia in 2005, and then her PhD at Montana State University in Bozeman in 2010. She went from there to a Shine NSF fellowship in Berkeley, and then to a research scientist position at the University of California in Berkeley. In 2018, she came to the department. She has a joint appointment with NSO, and we've been happy to have her. Masha's received a whole host of awards and honors. I'll just mention a couple of them. She was awarded an NSF Career Award in 2020 and a Brinson Foundation Fellowship in 2022. Masha studies magnetic fields in the sun, their evolution, and as you can see, reconnection and behavior in the sun. Those behaviors result in sudden release of magnetic energy that can cause coronal mass ejections and flares, and have space weather impacts. And today she'll talk to us about using the sun as a laboratory for magnetic reconnection.
Thank you so much, Mark. Yes, for the introduction. That was sudden. So today, yeah, what happens if Christoph shows up? We'll have to listen to the second one, second introduction. Okay, so today I'll talk about solar flares, and I decided to call them nature's lab for magnetic reconnection, because magnetic reconnection is what I believe drives the majority of large solar flares. And solar flares, they allow us to look directly at what happens during magnetic reconnection without having to build very complex plasma experiments. And this process is highly universal. It also happens in a bunch of other astrophysical plasma and also fusion plasma here on Earth in the lab. And this universality is what makes these flares so powerful as a research study topic. So my talk will consist of 3 parts. First, I'll introduce you to solar flares and coronal mass ejection and explain why they matter. Then I will tell you a bit about the progress of me and my group over the last years, specifically focusing on the origin of flares and the role of magnetic reconnection. And finally, I wrap up the talk by discussing some future directions and the unanswered questions. So let's start from the intro. So in May 2024, just a little bit over a year ago, some of you might remember, our star launched a series of large flares. Here we're looking at EUV at the surface of the sun. You see it's rotating. And they were one of the largest flares so one of the largest bursts of electromagnetic radiation across the whole spectrum called solar flares. And these were the largest flares observed since 2003. And they burst huge amount of radiation to space, and also launched coronal mass ejections, large bursts of plasma that we see in here in these different images called coronal mass ejections. These led to largest geomagnetic storms observed in decades here on Earth. And as a result of these geomagnetic storms, we've had, that was for sure the largest geomagnetic storm in the cell phone era. Auroras were pictured almost all over the Earth, from here in Boulder to even Ladakh, India. Can you imagine that? And there were shimmering curtains of green and red observed all over the Earth. But the storm also brought not only beauty, but also multiple societal impacts. In the energy sector, grid operators had to take emergency measures. Satellite operations experienced increased drag, leading to a bunch of mitigation maneuvers to minimize. Christoph, that's okay. Welcome. Mark kindly introduced me, so I said you probably were parking, don't worry. And then in aviation, transoceanic flights were rerouted. And then in GPS systems, declined precision of the GPS signal led to delayed planting and in the Midwest, and as a result, over hundreds of millions damages to the US economy alone. And that's not the end. On Earth, we've had heating of the atmosphere, such as we see on the left. The upper atmosphere doubled in temperature, and NASA Gold has observed these beautiful swirling patterns that, to my knowledge, haven't observed before. There were 2 extra radiation belts, these shells, areas around the Earth where particles get trapped, in addition to 2 permanent Van Allen belt probes. And these were observed by the NASA Colorado Inner Radiation Belt Experiment survey, constructed here at LASP. So to summarize, in just a few days, the sun basically rewrote the structure of the Earth's atmosphere, magnetosphere, and also the radiation belts. Other stars also have flares, and we call them stellar flares. On the left, we see an example of the typical time profile of some star, and this blip here is an example of a stellar flare seen in optical light. So you actually see brightening in white light. And on the right is the artist's idea of what might happen during a super flare. The whole star spot, which is actually much larger than anything we see on our own sun, just brightens. You see this brightening. That's just an artist's visualization of what might happen. So covering a large fraction of the stellar surface. And so similar to here on Earth, stellar flares, they also lead to a bunch of effects on the exoplanets. The flares and coronal mass ejection, they might lead to enhanced mass loss of the exoplanet's atmosphere, or they could completely blow the whole atmosphere away. But even if the atmosphere stays there, stellar flares are capable of affecting atmospheric chemistry, including ozone and greenhouse gases. And it all depends on the age of the star. Younger stars are more active. They host multiple flares every day. And so the atmospheres around, on the planets around, might not be so lucky to host life. But some calmer middle-aged stars like our sun today flare less often. And so we have planets such as ours that stand much better chance to have life. So yeah, our sun is an average middle-aged star. But here's what makes it special. It is close. Take, for example, red supergiant Antares. Here is the best image of a star rather than a sun of Antares from an 8-meter telescope on European Southern Observatory. And now compare that to the sun. We can see the sun in exquisite detail, down to features the size of 20 kilometers. Here's an example of the telescope that has even smaller radius than DKIST. That means that the sun is not just another star. It's the star that we could actually decode. And if we want to understand the magnetic activity and the effect of the magnetic activity of the stellar activity on other planets, then the sun is truly our Rosetta Stone. Okay? But let's go back to solar flares. Where does the energy of solar flares come from? It's all stored in the atmosphere of the star or solar corona. And here I show it in yellow color, so the solar loops here, and then the zoom in here. And so as the sun rotates, we see this sunspot moving, the black area moving with the surface. And at the same time, we see there is a lot of going on with these coronal loops, the yellow structures. So the structures, they get tangled by something below, the sunspots with strong magnetic field, the strong magnetic field regions, and shown in here. And so as the sunspots, they move, they tangle the coronal loops above, they store energy over days, and then over minutes, this energy gets suddenly released during the flare, okay? But the problem is that all the energy is stored in the atmosphere, but the only place we could actually measure magnetic fields is not where the energy is stored. We can only routinely measure magnetic fields on the solar surface, in the photosphere. And that's the whole problem, basically motivation for the recent work in my group. That's what makes modeling and indirect diagnostics basically very essential. The key mechanism that releases the energy stored in the corona is magnetic reconnection. And now let's zoom in on the active region. So here we have a sunspot. Here we're looking at the flare on the limb. So here is our sun, okay? And let's zoom in at this area where reconnection happens and look what reconnection is about. So this green area, which I highlighted, is the reconnection X point. And in this X point, we have basically opposite field line coming together and then reconnecting, changing their topology, and releasing huge amount of energy. The magnetic energy that's being released is at the rate of 10 to the 26 ergs per second. That's order of magnitude, to be precise, 4 orders of magnitude higher than any hydrogen bomb. The largest difficulties of understanding the details of this process is that it's highly multi-scale. The scale of this reconnection regions is on the order of meters, but then the scale of the areas where the energy gets released is megameters that we could observe, okay? And this process is universal. The same process powers black holes, flares, magnetar flares, planet auroras, and then fusion disruptions. So by observing this magnetic reconnection directly on the sun, we could actually advance our understanding of other scenarios. How did interest in magnetic reconnection evolve over the last decades? Here I've taken the yearly paper count by topic from 1960s till our days from the astrophysics data system. And I look at the abstracts that mention magnetic reconnection. Magnetic reconnection was first suggested as a concept in 1950s by Ron Giovanelli, the Australian physicist. And then in the 60s, James Dungy in the UK, he was the first who actually coined the term magnetic reconnection in his PhD thesis. And look what happened in the number of papers mentioning magnetic reconnection since then, since 1960s. Till 1990, it was kind of steadily growing, but it was still a very niche topic. And then since 1990s, the number of papers grew by over, from here to here by over 10 times. And now, anywhere you look, pretty much, from satellites in Earth's magnetosphere to flares on the sun to jets from black holes, reconnection is at the center of the story.
Is that a cumulative curve?
That's a monthly rate. Okay. Yeah, that's not a cumulative curve. Mm-hmm. So some areas actually stay flat. Yeah. So let's look a bit deeper at what's going on in solar flares. So since 1960s, the key question that magnetic reconnection community was trying to understand in solar flares is, can it explain the rate of energy release in solar flares? In other words, what rate can magnetic field lines, at what rate can magnetic field lines reconnect? And Sweet and Parker, after a productive science conference, they proposed the Sweet-Parker model of steady reconnection, in which these oppositely directed magnetic field lines, they reconnect across this steady current sheet. So there is some inflow speeds here, and then as a result, you have snapping of field lines in opposite directions, up and down, and that's called the Sweet-Parker reconnection. Since then, The Sweet-Parker reconnection was first used as a key component of the two-dimensional standard flare model that I show here. In this case, the reconnection happens across this current sheet in here. On the top, we have coronal mass ejection that's just sitting above. And as you have reconnection happening here, the new flux is being added to this twisted set of field lines called the flux rope above. And below the reconnection point, new field lines form, adding this closed arcade on the bottom. So these are the key components of the two-dimensional flare model, the classical flare model. The reason why it's loved by the solar community, this is the simplest version of it. There are more complicated ones. But the key reason why it's so popular is because it suggests ways to describe a lot of flare dynamics that we observe, including the newly reconnected loops that we see here, the foot points of the loop. So you have particles getting accelerated along this newly formed loops. They collide with the dense solar surface, and they form bright regions called ribbons. So you have loops, you have ribbons, all of which you observe, and you also have this set of closed field lines called coronal mass ejections. So here, just to show you what I'm talking about, here are the ribbons, the foot points of newly reconnected field lines. It's a movie from a solar dynamics observatory. And you see these ribbons moving apart. They correspond to opposite magnetic polarities. And as you have your reconnection happening higher and higher up, your field lines visually move apart. So you have newly formed field lines moving apart. On the right, you see an example of other beautiful observations of post-reconnection coronal loops. These are high-density temperature loops. And finally, the third component that I've mentioned, the coronal mass ejections. Shown here from a difference image, white light, and then here is this white circle is our sun. Okay. And so I've told, now hopefully you have a cartoon of what happens during the flare, okay? But what happens with the energy? So now let's follow the energy of coronal magnetic fields. As I told you, it's all about coronal magnetic fields. And the energy of coronal magnetic fields at its minimum state is a potential field. So there is no energy. The potential field doesn't have extra energy to release. But as we move and tangle these coronal magnetic fields, we actually add, through the photospheric motion, we actually add this extra free magnetic energy above the potential energy in the corona. And so you have this extra free magnetic energy that could be released during the flare. The question is, how does it happen? So there are two scenarios here. It's either ideal eruptive instability without reconnection, that I'll talk a bit later, or it could be a non-ideal process like reconnection in solar corona that destabilizes the system. And then after that, this extra free magnetic energy that before was just sitting there without doing anything, but after the instability, this extra free magnetic energy gets partitioned, gets released in the first phase as heat, kinetic energy of our coronal mass ejections, or fast plasmoids. These are just key components, but not all of it. But that's not the end of the story. You could have extra stages of the energy partition, and during the second phase, the kinetic energy of the CME could drive shocks and accelerate particles, particularly the solar energetic particles that are so harmful for us here on Earth. So this whole process of energy conversion takes minutes to hours, while the build-up takes days before then. So to sum up my introduction part one, solar flares and coronal mass ejections are extremely important. They shape our planets, and they also drive space weather. And they also provide the closest lab for stellar context and the global view on magnetic reconnection. They're both important from the fundamental physics point of view and also for our society. Now, in my solar magnetism group, that I started, which I started when I came here to Boulder. We work on a variety of topics, largely centered on improved understanding of solar magnetism. So currently we're about 10 team members, myself, 3 research scientists, 4 graduate students, some of the faces you could recognize here, and also we have 3 guest or non-supervised members like Utah and Caroline, and also James, who work on very similar projects, and I don't supervise them, but nevertheless we weekly meet to discuss science together. In addition, we've had some alumni, 1 postdoc, 3 master's students, and also 2 undergraduate students. And over the time I've been here, we've produced over 40 referred publications. 28 of them were led by me and the group members. And the focus of our research has been largely centered on flares and CME, dynamics and magnetism, as well as quiet sun magnetism, using both variety of observations, both ground-based and space-based, and simulations. So I'm not going to cover all of these papers that we've written and all the topics. Today I decided to focus on the origin of flares and the role of magnetic reconnection. And specifically, I will focus on the 6 key questions with both observations and simulations. Which magnetic fields are most likely to reconnect? Do all of them reconnect? Or just some of them? Which ones? Is reconnection bursty and filamentary? Or it's smooth, like Sui and Parker proposed? Why do some flares erupt as coronal mass ejections and others don't? These are all from the observation. And then using simulations, I will answer, how are pre-flare magnetic structures built up? How does reconnection reshape the magnetic fields in 3D? And finally, what is the structure of coronal mass ejection? I'm not going to answer this question, but I'm going to at least address the direction in which we should move to get a better feeling of what's going on. Okay. So let's then proceed. So before tackling all this question, I just want to set up the scene and say what made all of this work possible. So when I was graduating with my PhD from Montana State University, a year before, Solar Dynamics Observatory was launched into space. And the Solar Dynamics Observatory presented us with the first chance to have routine vector magnetic field measurements and also flare observations on the same platform. And here we see observations from the SDO. What we see are the positive and negative direction of the vertical magnetic field, and the little hairy stuff is the actual direction of the magnetic field. Okay, and so we see the emergence, the actual emergence observed on the sun that we're tracking here over days, 6 days of active region of sunspot evolution. So these observations basically paved the road for the first detailed quantitative studies, including statistical studies of many flares, as well as modeling efforts that I will show today. So in our first statistical study, we asked the basic question, which magnetic fields are most likely to reconnect? And we found, looking at several thousands of flares, we made several important, simple but important discoveries. First of all, we found that reconnecting fields are stronger and more sheared than non-reconnecting fields, as shown in here. 4,000 of flares. Second, we found that the flare energy is actually defined by the amount of flux that gets reconnected, as shown here. So it's all about the flux that gets reconnected that defines how much radiation will yield from a flare. And then finally, we found that it's not all active region that gets restructured during the flare. There is a certain limit, and this limit is larger for larger flares. But up to 40% for our own star, only up to 40% of active region magnetic field could contribute, could participate in the reconnection. These results were the first time when we quantitatively described for a range of flares what our sun is doing, which is both fundamental for our understanding of both solar and stellar flares. Addressing the second question, is flare reconnection steady and smooth, or is it bursty and filamentary? Well, Parker, Sweet and Parker, they predicted, you remember this, smooth current sheet. But more recent works, simulations specifically, they suggest that the current sheet actually is not smooth. It breaks into this circular, twisted, island-like structures called plasmoids, as you see here. Here we're looking at the cross-section on the side, which could, in principle, lead to bursty rate of the reconnection, and as a result, very bursty dynamics of the flare. So can we actually verify it somehow using our own sun? Well, the problem with that is that we cannot just zoom on the reconnection region. It's very small, and then second, if we just look at the sun directly, you can only see some proxies on the limb. But nevertheless, we could look at the foot points of reconnective field lines, which are the ribbons. You remember the spreading beautiful movie that I've shown you before? And IRIS, a NASA satellite, has been observing flare ribbons in high details, and it has shown us that indeed these ribbons, they have a lot of fine structure, which provides evidence that it's very likely that reconnection is quite bursty. But to answer this question, I just want to show two studies that we've done. It's hard to see here. But the first study, led by Marcel Corchada-Albello, a graduate student in our group, looked at the reconnection rate, so the rate at which magnetic reconnection proceeds from these ribbon observations, finding that this blue curve, it's hard to see, but then this blue curve clearly oscillates, and it happens in dozens of flare. And it oscillates together with the particle acceleration proxy in hard X-rays. So that's, which suggests basically that it is very likely that you have the sequence of large plasmoids that you see here that keep reconnecting and cause this bursty behavior in the amount of reconnection flux. And then the second study I want to show here has been performed by Rahul Yadav, research scientist in our group, using DKIST observations. And he has found that ribbons that we see in here, there's a different event, actually break into these periodic blobs. And that's not just one event. We actually see it with different observations. So from these and some other works, we conclude that reconnection is not smooth, but is very bursty, controlling when and how particles are accelerated. Now, when we're talking about the flares, one of the core questions is whether the flare becomes a coronal mass ejection or does it stay confined. In fact, we find that there are lots of flares, even huge, large X-class flares, that don't lead to coronal mass ejection. So what exactly is happening there? So here I want to show a different study where we analyzed hundreds of flares confined without CMEs and eruptive flares, and we found several interesting findings. For a similar flare size, we found that confined flares without CMEs, without coronal mass ejections, shown in blue here, they tend to be hotter. So for the same flare class, for some reason, confined flares are hotter. But that's not the end. The confined flares, they also tend to be faster to reconnect than eruptive flares. So they reconnect faster. And then finally, confined flares, they tend to cover a smaller spot fraction. So while the eruptive flares, they tend to cover a larger spot fraction, as shown in here. From these and some other findings, we conclude that whether a flare erupts depends on this balance between the overlying field, but not just any overlying field of the sunspot itself and the released energy, the reconnection flux. Okay. So to wrap up, observations are extremely important. Sun and the solar flares, hundreds of solar flares, they have huge amounts of diversity in terms of the magnetic field evolution and dynamics. But so the statistical studies are very good to present, to give us the idea of what happens overall with solar flares and the variety of these dynamics. But if we want to look at the details of coronal magnetic fields, for that we really need models because we cannot observe the coronal magnetic fields directly. And so modeling solar corona started many, many years ago. And it started with data-inspired models that use idealized magnetograms for the lower boundary. So here is an example of the idealized line-of-sight magnetic field that is used as an input for the data-inspired simulations. As we've seen, our sun is much more complex than that. Here is an example from the SDO magnetic field measurements. And these kind of data could be used to drive the coronal magnetic fields models using the so-called data-driven models, which rely on the observation. The question is how can we use these observations to drive the simulations of coronal magnetic field dynamics? We cannot just stick the vertical component of the magnetic field on the solar surface at each time step of our simulations. This will cause our simulation to blow up. You need some smart wave to drive gradually all your system with electric fields. And so over the last 10 years, me and my group members, we have worked a lot and pioneered developing methods, as well as collaborators, to derive the electric fields that are necessary as an input for this type of simulations. And even this summer, we're still making lots of progress. We've learned a lot, but even this summer, we've had International Space Science Institute team meeting where we focused on how to actually do a better job in deriving these electric fields that are needed as input for these complex simulations. But I'm not going to talk about this work that we're doing here. I just want to show you the progress that we've made over the last 10 years, because now we're finally capable of finding electric fields needed for this type of simulations that are capable to reproduce what the sun is doing, and furthermore, let us peek into details of the coronal field dynamics. So here's an example of magnetic fields, and also the three components of magnetic fields, Bx, By, Bz, and also the three components of derived velocity fields and electric fields over 6 days of solar evolution at the solar surface. Notice that in this case, we were actually able to observe the whole system from the very beginning. So we see first no fields, and then the sunspot basically emerges. So we observe the whole accumulation process of this energy buildup, which is extremely important. The problem is that typically as the sun rotates with a period of 27 days, and then the sunspots, they could live over several months. This is a very rare scenario. Typically, we already observed the sun has emerged, and we don't have this luxury of understanding the whole build-up period. So tracking is really key. So we then use this electric field as an input for our coronal models. And here, I want to show you this first, let's see, that's a movie. Yeah, here I want to show you this first data-driven model of a coronal magnetic field over 6 days from the birth to an X-class flare. So here, the red color shows basically synthetic coronal image. The blue and green color show the photospheric magnetic fields that we use for driving the top view and the side view. The key point I want to make here is that the result of this simple setup was very clear. The pre-flare structure is a result of gradual days-long dynamics that includes this emergence of structure, shearing, cancellation, and it's really important to track this whole build-up period. So one of the big questions is, what is the magnetic field before the flare actually happens? we know that at the core of any coronal mass ejection lies a twisted structure of magnetic fields, so-called the flux rope. But the question is, where is this flux rope created? Is this created before we have a flare, or the reconnection is what creates this twisted set of field lines? So from our analysis here, as shown below, where we look at the sides of the magnetic field, where we look at the active region and coronal magnetic fields from the side and from the top, it was very clear that it was a set of sheared arcade rather than a flux rope that formed the structure of this active region before the flare. So it was not a flux rope. Then what happens during the flare? How does reconnection reshape the magnetic field in 3 dimensions? Here we actually tracked the field lines that reconnect, and we colored them by the time when reconnection happens. So reconnection first happens in the lower lying white points, but then we keep tracking it, then in red points, green. And so we see that the overall structure of the magnetic field changes. It becomes much more like a coherent structure as it erupts. And below, we also have this set of closed field lines. These are these loops that I've shown you before in the simple standard flare model that separates with time, which is consistent with a classical 2D flare scenario, where you have ribbons forming further and further away from the polarity inversion line that separates this opposite polarity. So the key point here is that reconnection is not a single blast. It's a very nicely staged process that reshapes the magnetic system, building the erupting structure above and reorganizing the fields below. Okay. And then here we wanted to look at the structure of the coronal mass ejection. So what happens with the field as it actually erupts? For that, we actually traced much more field lines as a function of time, the same set of field lines during the flare and then as it erupts higher up. So from this analysis, we found 3 stages of this process. During the pre-flare stage, there is a gradual rise of highly sheared fields. Then reconnection happens lower down, which proceeds higher up, and then there is a fastly rising coronal mass ejection. And then during the third stage, there is relaxation of the fields when the outer structure, the outer flux rope leaves and the inner flux rope stays. The final coronal mass ejection structure is this double shell flux rope that I show here below, which has different colors because we color it by the orientation, basically, of its twist. So it's what I call the double shell CME. And so that's just simulation. Can we actually compare it somehow with observations? And for the same active region, we were actually extremely lucky. That was in 2011. But stereo observed the same event from a different vantage point, and we found that there is the same double shell structure shown on the right, observed by the satellite. The key point here I want to make is that CMEs are not just simple plasma bubbles, like the standard flare model suggests. They are multi-layered magnetic structures shaped by days of energy buildup and then rapid reconnection. So let me now bring together all these pieces that we learned from observations and from simulations. From observations, 3 lessons stand out that I want to talk about. The strongest and most sheared fields are most likely to reconnect. And not all fields, but only up to 40% of the sunspot participates. Reconnection is a highly bursty and filamentary process. Whether a flare occurs or not depends on the balance between the overlying field and the released energy. And then from the simulation, we could actually now peek directly into what happens with magnetic fields. And these simulations, they look very much now similar to the observations. And we learned that flaring fields get energized gradually as sunspots evolve. Tracking these dynamics is really key. During the flare, the sequence of reconnections, reshapes the whole active region. And then the CME is not simply a plasma bubble, but it's a complex layered structure, more intricate than we ever imagined. And to summarize, flare and CMEs are born from days of this gradual magnetic buildup, punctuated by bursts of reconnection that sometimes launch storms all the way towards Earth. Now, as I bring this talk towards its conclusion, I want to focus on the future, on the big unresolved questions that, in my view, will shape not just my group, but also flare and plasma physics in the next decade. The first question is, what is the flare trigger? Second, how does reconnection operate in realistic 3D? And finally, how are particles accelerated to high energies in flares? So my first question on what triggers solar flares is related to the buildup phase. What happens with this long-term buildup of magnetic energy? What is the role of different components of photospheric evolution, like shearing, cancellation, and rotation, in the forming of flux ropes and then current sheets above? We've just looked at one or two events. That's very little. But what happens in more complex systems? Lately, we've had a lot of observations of complex systems such as homologous flares, subsequent flares in the same active region. Sympathetic flares, flares that happen in neighboring regions within short time gap. And then finally, interacting CMEs, coronal mass ejections that interact further out in the heliosphere that accelerate particles much more efficiently than just single CMEs. How are they related to activity on the sun? So how does this complex system evolve? To answer these big questions, we plan to perform statistics of flares and interacting CME properties, relating this to solar origins, performing MHD models of active region energy buildup with several flares in larger domains, and also, of course, multi-height magnetic field observations that are now becoming more and more available from high-resolution ground-based observations. And then the trigger. What actually triggers a flare? We know the ingredients. It's the stressed magnetic fields and sudden release, but exact trigger is unresolved. There are two key component leading ideas here. It's either ideal instability, such as kink instability, where your flux rope is twisted beyond a certain threshold, or torus instability, where your overlying field decays beyond a certain threshold. That's one idea, the ideal instability. Or it could be the magnetic reconnection that I've talked a lot before. Or maybe it's a combination of two of them, where they act in some kind of feedback. To understand this question, I think that we could do a lot by simply looking at statistical analysis of pre-flare evolution from multiple vantage points. We've been looking a lot at what happens during the flare itself, but what happens 2 hours before large flares in terms of their both magnetic field and thermal evolution. And then we plan to do trigger analysis from MHD simulation of more cases to understand what's happening there. And then finally, wrapping up the flare dynamics the flare dynamics questions. One of the big questions that I'm very interested in is how are coronal mass structures formed? In my talk, I showed this example where we've created this double shell CME, but from recent observation, like for example from Parker Solar Probe, this paper by Scheik shows that we could have triple shell CMEs. So what exactly is going on in this case is on the sun. So for that, I believe we could learn a lot by even simply looking at the coronal magnetic field diagnostics for these events, including DKIST and radio, as well as MHD simulations. My second open question is about magnetic reconnection. How does it operate in realistic 3D? Classical most of the current work has been focused on two dimensions. However, the sun is 3D, and we see now so much fine structure. Here is just an example, not directly related to magnetic reconnection, but just an example of all the fine structure you could see. Recent observations led by Cole Tambura graduate students from DKIST, X-class flare observed by DKIST, and here are the flare ribbons. Look at all this fine structure. How can we explain all of it? And the key sub-question that I see here in answering this big question is, what triggers reconnection in complex magnetic configurations? How do MHD scale fields link to kinetic scale dissipations? How do we deal with this huge range of scales? What roles do plasmoids and turbulence play in fast energy release? And finally, we cannot observe the reconnection region directly, but which proxies could we use from both, from our knowledge from simulations, which proxies could we help us track the reconnection dynamics in observations? To address this question, in my group, we plan to focus on the multi-vantage point observations and also high-resolution observations. And least but not last, how are fast particles accelerated in flares? We know that flares are one of the most efficient particle acceleration sites in the solar system. Here I show an example of hard X-ray observations of a flare loop. We see hard X-ray sources, which are proxies for particle acceleration sites at the loop top and the foot points. So how do particles exactly get accelerated in flares? To answer this question, it's important to know the magnetic field structure. So it's important first to understand how is the pre-flare magnetic energy built up. That's my question 1 that I've talked about before. How does reconnection reshape the fields? That's both my questions 1 and 2 that I talked in my future slides, just a couple of slides before. And then the final question is, how is the energy transported and partitioned into heating, waves, and energetic particles? These are very big questions, and I don't think we're going to be able to answer this question soon. But I believe that combination of different types of model, including 3D MHD model that allows you to peek into realistic magnetic field configuration, kinetic simulations for particle acceleration, and transport together with this observation would help us advance our understanding in these directions. And of course, none of this would be possible without exciting recent and future observation capabilities. Here I want to just mention some of the most exciting ones. Solar Orbiter that was launched in 2020, a NASA ESA mission, has been flying around the sun at different distances and observing magnetic fields, corona, and particle acceleration from different vantage points, which allows us to understand lots of aspects about my future unanswered questions, such as energy storage, trigger, reconnection, particles. Inouye Solar Telescope, DKIST, has been operating since 2022. We've published several papers on it already. Working with ground-based observations is a steep learning curve, though, for students. So I believe we're just in the beginning of our road. So DKIST provides us with these unique observations of the magnetic fields in the chromosphere. Before I was only talking about the photospheric magnetic field measurements and also corona on the limb. These are absolutely invaluable for understanding how magnetic fields are being, how the energy is being stored during the build-up phase, and also, the energy storage. And also, using observation of the corona, you could actually get the the coronal magnetic field measurements. The third mission, the multi-slit Solar Explorer MUSE, will hopefully be launched sometime soon after 2026, will provide us with unprecedented view of coronal dynamics and heating. The key points here will be extremely high cadence, which would allow us to advance our knowledge of trigger and reconnection. And then finally, the EUVST, EUV high throughput telescope, okay, thank you, will provide us with this multi-layer view of chromosphere and corona, extremely wide spectrum information about what's happening in the chromosphere and corona full disk, addressing many of the questions that I've talked about before. So it's exciting time. It's really exciting time to be a student. And I have no doubts that a bright future is awaiting us. And at this note, I want just to thank all of my collaborators and students. I couldn't have done it without you. And thank you for your attention.
Questions? Can I put the first priority on
Students.
graduate students? Can we have a graduate student question? I'll give you the other microphone. Just to warn you, graduate students, we like to have a tradition of allowing the first questions to be asked by graduate students. So for future reference, but in the meantime, Shannon.
While we wait, fantastic. I have two, but I'll start with the first one. So we know that sunspots, as they start to originate in the poles and migrate towards the equator during a solar cycle, often this is a very, very well understood and well documented butterfly diagram. However, the coronal mass ejections, if you actually to map them, don't quite follow the same trend. Do you have any insight into why we don't see the same kind of eruptive CME events from that sort of the migration of those sunspots towards the equator?
That's an excellent question. Why don't we see CMEs from higher latitudes? That's what you're basically asking.
Because that sort of starts, especially like sort of looping back in, no pun intended, into your discussion about, the shearing and also the structure above the spot.
So what we found is that what actually primarily defines whether a flare becomes a CME or not is not just global fields, but the local field of the sunspot itself. But then the question is, do you actually see same number of large flares in the higher latitude regions? What do statistics tell us there?
Yeah, we don't actually, I think, see that high latitude CME distribution the same way.
Flares.
Oh yeah, with flares, yeah. So that's my question.
Do we see the same number of flares for higher latitude active regions? I don't recall any statistical studies. Maybe there have been something. I know for sure that the largest active regions, they really happen closer to the equator, but I just don't recall any statistical studies looking at the productivity rates, production rates of flares. That's an excellent question. Yeah.
We can add that to our future paper list. Okay.
Yep.
More questions?
I'd like to ask a question that is maybe not graduate student level, maybe not even undergraduate student level. But could you go back to the slide that had Q3? Because it had some images. One more back.
Yes.
Okay. Just looking at the diagram on the lowest, the picture on the lowest left-hand side. Mm-hmm. You showed a number of images, animations of these things. Now, what is an individual spaghetti strand there?
Yes, the individual spaghetti, that's a great question. The individual spaghetti strings are actual magnetic field lines that are rooted at the surface of the sun. So the white and black,
Yeah, okay, so
Background is the photospheric magnetic field of the solar surface, and the
are
string.
you showing only a few of
Yes.
what might be billions?
Yes,
Okay,
there might be billions, but
Yeah,
in this
okay.
case, it's just a random,
yeah.
random
Now,
pixels being spaced.
you mentioned that you get flares when there's strong shear.
Yes.
Shear of what? Of the environment, the plasma flow, shear?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So the shear that I'm talking about is primarily the shear at the that you don't really see here. So there are different types of shear. When I was talking about the photospheric shear, is the shear that you observe at the solar surface of the direction of the field with respect to the potential field direction. But then there is also another shear in the coronal field where you basically compare the shear between the 3D potential field here and then the actual magnetic fields that you get from your model. But it basically describes the amount of non-potential free energy that could be released during the flare.
And the environment for these two is a plasma?
And the environment, say it again?
These tubes are in
So these are, infinitely small field lines. They basically follow the direction of the plasma flows, yeah. Mm-hmm, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your question. I didn't cover them, but they're very, very important, yeah.
Hi, nice talk. I was wondering about, like, from this your work, we can infer the surface magnetic field of the sun, or let's say star. But can we say anything about the magnetic field within the core, like radiative core for the sun, or in general, in case of any star?
So in this case, we're only focusing on the magnetic fields at the surface from the observations, and then we use these observed magnetic fields to try to understand what's the three-dimensional magnetic field in the solar atmosphere. Mm-hmm. What happens below the photosphere is a completely different question, and the fields are much more messy there, and the plasma conditions are completely different there.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, great talk. I just have a question. I just started learning about MHD, so I'm pretty new to all of this. But in class, when we were learning about the Lorentz force, we were talking about a force that always pushes plasmas from high pressure to low pressure, and a force that tries to straighten the magnetic field lines. So I'm just like wondering what the evolution of these field lines over longer periods of time looks like. Are they being pushed back down below the surface? Are they being pushed like outwards to be straightened?
So basically the Lorentz force, so I cannot say anything below the surface.
Right.
Here we're focusing primarily on what happens above the surface, but yes, the Lorentz force tends to straighten it back, yeah. So,
Okay.
not, yeah, to make it less curvy, yeah. Mm-hmm. More potential, yeah.
Yeah. As I recall, there are many measurements of heating prior to flares, and maybe even minutes or perhaps even hours before. So my question is the thermal heating process a symptom of the trigger or a cause of the trigger, leading to some type of instability, perhaps involving ionization? So a symptom or a cause?
Are you talking about the heating that you observe lower down